Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us for the valedictory session of the international conference that IIC and the Indian Council for Cultural Relations are collaborating on, Connected Histories, Shared Present, Cross-Cultural Experiences between Latin America, the Caribbean and India. We are honored to have as the guest of honor, Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Honourable Minister for External Affairs. May I request the Director, IIC, Shri K. N. Srivastav, to welcome the gathering. Mr. Srivastav has had many important positions, including Secretary and Financial Advisor in the Ministry of External Affairs and Secretary in the Ministry of Civil Aviation.
President of Indian International Center, Ambassador Sri Shyam, Honourable Minister for External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar, former President and Life Trustee of IIC, Sri N. Vora, Life Trustee of IIC, Sri Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, scholars from Latin America and Caribbean countries, scholars from India, ladies and gentlemen. Last 3 days we had interesting discussion on this important subject of connected histories and shared present between Latin American countries, Caribbean and India. We covered various aspects starting from culture, literature, art, music, cinema and several other things. More about the deliberations, our Chief Reporter is going to present a report. We are very fortunate that for this valedictory function, we have amidst us our External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, who does not need any introduction. All of you are familiar with him. I am indeed very grateful to you, sir, that you have been able to take out your time and extend a very hearty welcome on behalf of IIC and on behalf of everybody present over here to you. I also welcome our President, Ambassador Shyam sir, who has been guiding us through and through, during this conference. I extend a warm welcome to Sri N. Vora, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, our Life Trustees, to all the scholars from Latin America and Caribbean countries as well as from India. I particularly would like to acknowledge the contribution made by the members of the organizing committee and particularly the the conference coordinator, Dr. Sonia Gupta. So with these few words, once again, hearty welcome to each one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I request our Chief Rapporteur, Dr. Akshay Kale, to come and present the sum up. Dr. Kale is pursuing a PhD in Latin American Studies, and he is taught at the Instituto Cervantes for 5 years.
Thank you, Niharika. Yeah, sure. Thanks. I would first of all like to thank the IIC for inviting me to the Chief Rapporteur for this conference, which has been riveting 2 days of a dynamic exchange on the theme of India, Latin America, and the connected histories and shared present. And the extent of these experiences has been extremely enriching for all of us. And I would also like to thank Dr. Sonia Gupta for organizing the conference, and Honourable Minister of External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar, for honouring us with his presence, as well as Ambassador Shyam, President of the Indian International Center. We are in the midst of a range of intellectuals from Latin America, the Caribbean, as well as India, and it's actually quite a task to summarize. I don't have a lot of time. It's quite a task summarizing what has been discussed over these 2 days, or these 3 days rather, beginning with the initial remarks of Dr. Jorge Volpi, eminent Mexican author and critic, who talked about how culture and literature in Latin America were substitutes for an impossible modernity, and this sort of brings us back to also to Benedict Anderson's notion of imagined communities and how literature played an important role in that context in Latin America. Dr. Volpe also talked about the blend of lyricism and the chronicle and the prodigious tropical language which characterizes magical realism in Latin America. And he rather ironically also mentioned how it came to a point where we are all Macondo, everyone was perceived as being Macondo, and all the writers were viewed from that prism. In this case, I think it was especially interesting what he said regarding Roberto Bolaño as being the last great Latin American writer. And he concluded his session by indicating this shift towards intimacy from Pan-Americanism, from beyond a jaded magic realism. He heralded the rise of women writers who are carving out their spaces, and this reaffirmation of the feminine voices, or the voices of the which were suppressed during the 20th century. And one of the things which stuck with me as a scholar of Latin American studies and also as an ardent reader of Latin American literature was Jorge Volpe's contention that Latin America is a fertile land for lies and fictions. And I thought it was really interesting because he also juxtaposed it with the rise of non-fiction and this particular testimonial literature which has emanated from the Latin American continent, especially in the last decade or so. A trend which was started in the 1970s, but which has maybe reached its apogee in the last couple of years. Moving on, we had another excellent session by Dr. Alejandro Garay regarding the Mayan civilization, and he talked about the millennial culture and the resilience of the Mayan civilization through the ages, and it is something that he drew parallels with this vis-a-vis this resilience in the Indian context as well. It was also an interesting journey through the Mayan customs and Mayan traditions. And particularly I found the paper really interesting as he took us through the pre-classic, the classic and the post-classic period of the Mayan civilization. Having been in Tikal myself in Guatemala, it was an interesting, it was a real eye-opener. Later on, we had papers of different hues and talked about different themes, diverse topics, and which interestingly weaved into each other and created a rich tapestry of intellectual and thought-provoking discussion. I would like to highlight Professor Kumar Mahabi's paper, which talked about the hybridization of the chutney genre in music and the influence of Sundar Popo, which has transcended the Caribbean. And it was interesting to note that we've been humming a lot of his melodies, Sundar Popo's melodies, without even knowing who the original author was, giving the lie maybe to the importance of the main creator and actually highlighting the importance of these bridges, which are sometimes constructed almost unconsciously and unwittingly, and which bind our two civilizations and our rich cultures. His paper was followed by another paper on the epistemological traditions of India by Professor G.N. Devi called Sunya Kha Zero, where he stressed on the concept of zero and going beyond the transcendental contribution of India to mathematics, which everyone knows is zero. I mean, the contribution is not zero, is the zero, right? So precisely Dr. G.N. Devi talked about the importance of zero as being more than absence or nothingness and carrying various ideas and interpretations. And he also accentuated how these concepts could also be interpreted in relation to social conjunctures, particular social conjunctures, and how we can use them on a practical plane as well, going beyond the mere epistemological and the philosophical. In the second day, in the second session, we had another couple of interesting papers on the Caribbean. One of the papers which really stayed with me was how Jamaican culture has adopted Indian traditions. And I remember when I studied about Latin America, we had these primers on Latin American culture, and we saw images of how the Latin Americans had adopted Catholicism for their and integrated indigenous practices into Catholicism. a similar image was presented yesterday in the paper where you could see the people from the Jamaicans having adopted Indian traditions, going to Indian Hindu temples and mosques as well, but having adopted these religions for according to their own practices, and how the Caribbeans maintain this rich cultural heritage, this rich Indian heritage, which has a rather tormented past of indentured labor, but how, in spite of having lost language, according to one of the presenters, in spite of having lost the linguistic contacts, how culture is being retained in what can be best called as a cultural remittance. I think that was one of the most important sort of observations made in this respect. The concept of cultural remittances, which was expounded upon. We also had papers on literature, and in this respect, especially on poetry, we had Alex Pauseres Aguilar presenting on poetry as a means of communication, as the bridge and the pathway, and how poetry is capable of planting wondrous seeds of life devoid of wars, and how it can harbor hopes for a future full of beauty, right? So he emphasized on beauty in poetry, and also, well, the good, the beautiful, and the true in poetry. So in that sense, I thought it was a very original observation of his. We also had a very interesting comparative study between Juan Rulfo and Mahatma Gandhi on the analogous realizations of the need for autonomy and the need for social awareness. It was indeed a very original paper presented by Professor Wendy Phillips, as she illustrated how in Rulfo's stories, such as Nos han quitado la tierra, they'll snatch the land away from us. These echoes of Mahatma Gandhi can be found. This paper was followed by a brilliant session by a brilliant exposition by Professor Minisani from DU. She spoke on the Indian poems of Octavio Paz, and while Octavio Paz's prose writing on India has been widely studied, it was very illuminating to see how Octavio Paz saw India through his poetry, and the evolution of his thought and his engagement with Buddhism through and Indian traditions through poetry and through his poetry collections such as Ladera Este, Eastern Slope. She also emphasized on the Octavio Paz non-Eurocentric vision and the embrace of shunyata, which is again irrelevance, impermanence. So this concept of shunyata, which we saw in the first in G.N. Devi's paper, was found an interesting echo in the poetry of Octavio Paz, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Minisani. This was followed by a brilliant presentation by Abhay Kumar, diplomat and poet, who talked about Cecilia Meirelles, a Brazilian writer, and her fascination for India, and her how she was inspired to write poems on Tagore. He also portrayed her as an ardent admirer of things as characteristic things from India, as diverse as the embroidery work of Kashmir, the Pink City, and he also ended his exposition by talking about his own experiences in Latin America and how he has harnessed these experiences to write poetry about Latin America and exploring this connection through his poetry as well. We also had artists talk about their exposure to India, and Patricia Romano talked about the Guru Shishya Parampara and how the tradition of the Guru Shishya, and how maybe it was time to recalibrate and look back at it and maybe recover it from the throes of modernity, which has maybe corroded this tradition. We also had Fernando Aldivieso, and in his own words, when I asked him what I should say about his presentation, he just said one thing: art is the solution for everything. So I will leave it as it is. I don't think it requires any further explanation. And lastly, we had Dr. Indranil Chakravarti, whose paper I thought was a seminal contribution to the study of the parallels between Indian and Latin American cinema. Latin American cinema in itself is a topic which has not been broadly studied in India. And what was fascinating was his division of Latin American cinema into 4 key movements, culminating in a transnational cinema, and to quote him, which has a historicizing impulse. So you have blockbusters being made by Latin American directors such as Alfonso Cuarón, Guillermo del Toro, and Alejandro González Iñárritu. But these films, while being blockbusters and by raking in the millions of dollars, at the same time they have a historicizing impulse and weave a tapestry of Latin American society with what is formally called a network narrative. So I thought this was really interesting. Today's session was equally enriching. We had a number of papers, and I personally thought Dr. Oscar Puyol's exposition on Francisco Madero and the way he engaged with the Bhagavad Gita and how he felt like Arjuna while issuing the call for Mexican Revolution 1910, I thought was something which, as a Latin Americanist, as a Hispanist of who is interested in such topics, it was really revealing and something which was which gave a lot of food for thought. We also had another presentation on the influence of Sanskrit in Costa Rica, Sanskrit studies in Costa Rica, and I was really surprised and really glad to know that Sanskrit studies has had a long tradition of 50 years in Costa Rica, with an annual intake of 30 to 40 students who study Sanskrit. We also had an interesting exposition by Javier Sotomayor from Cinepolis, Mexico, which linked up with what Indranil had already talked about, and that was the difference in the cinema-going habits between India and Latin America. So interestingly, while Hollywood still has its hold over Latin America, regional cinema in India has resisted, and Indians mostly watch regional cinema. And here, what has to be stressed is that it's not only Bollywood, it's cinema from Karnataka as well. I have to find out. It's cinema from Karnataka and from the south as well, from Tamil Nadu and from Andhra Pradesh, which has been fundamental in this regard. I'll just wind up by talking about what Soraya Caro, who has come here from Colombia, talked about the similar challenges faced by Indian and Colombian youth. And finally, from the perspective of politics, we had Ambassador Jorge Heine talking about the idea of active non-alignment. So we had an interesting sort of session there where he talked about the similarities of India and Latin America and how both the regions should work in close cooperation. So that's all from my side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kale, for rising to the challenge to capture all this. I will now request our chair, Ambassador Shyam Saran, President of the IIC, for his remarks. Ambassador Shyam Saran is former Foreign Secretary of India and served as Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. After leaving government service, he headed the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, a think tank focusing on economic issues, and was chairman of the National Security Advisory Board under the National Security Council. He is currently president of the India International Center and honorary senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. His book, How India Sees the World, was published in 2017, and last year he published his second book, How China Sees India and the World. He has been awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India for his contribution to civil service, and in 2019, the Emperor of Japan decorated him with the Spring Order Gold and Silver Star for his services in promoting Indo-Japan relations.
Honourable Minister for External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar, Shri N.N. Voraji, and Mrs. Monakshi Gopinathan, Life Trustees of India International Center, the Director of the Center, Mr. Srivastava, Excellencies, our friends visiting from Latin America, Indian scholars who have been participating in this conference. A very good afternoon to all of you. I know that EM is short of time, so I will say very few words. It has been a wonderful conference from what we have just heard from our rapporteur, and just underscores the need for many such interactions between India and Latin America, as well as the Caribbean. I think for me, what has really emerged is, how we sometimes, miss the spectrum of colors which Latin America and the Caribbean present, because we somehow in our minds look at this in a monolithic kind of a category. But the immense diversity that this region represents mirrors, in fact, the kind of diversity that India itself has. So that itself is such a point of affinity between the two sides. Many people may think that what unites India, Latin America and Caribbean together are, of course, poetry, culture, films, Bollywood. Those are certainly important. People may think that politics is perhaps not so important. But I think EM will agree with me that, my own experience as a negotiator with EM of the Indo-US nuclear deal, the civil nuclear agreement, if one did not have the support of several Latin American countries and Caribbean, we wouldn't have got to where we were. So anybody who thinks that politics is not important in terms of the relationship that we have with Latin America and Caribbean, think again. With those words, I would like to first of all thank the India International Center, the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, and all our very distinguished friends, artists, scholars, who have come, as I said, from a long distance away, and our own scholars who have, with a certain degree of passion and dedication, have really, concentrated a lifetime of their work on Latin America and the Caribbean. We owe a great debt of gratitude to you. Thank you very much, and I would now invite Dr. Jaishankar, first of all, to release a book by our very distinguished colleague, Ambassador Vishwanathan. Is the book there?
Sorry, Ambassador Jorge Heine's book on Latin American policies, the New World Order, the active non-alignment option.
Yeah.
The book is just out.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Should we come to the center?
Vishwanath, you want to come? I would now like to invite our External Affairs Minister to speak on this occasion, deliver the valedictory address.
We're honored to have with us Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Honourable Minister for External Affairs. He is also a member of the Upper House or Rajya Sabha of India's Parliament from the state of Gujarat. He was Foreign Secretary from 2015 to 18, Ambassador to the United States in 2013 to 15, China 2009 to 13, and Singapore 2007 to 9, and the Czech Republic from 2000 to 2004. He has served in other diplomatic missions in Moscow, Colombo, Budapest, and Tokyo, as well as in the Ministry of External Affairs and the President's Secretariat. He is also President of Global Corporate Affairs at the Tata Sons Private Limited from May 2018. Dr. Jaishankar has a master's and PhD in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. He's a recipient of the Padma Shri Award in 2019 and has written a widely acclaimed book, The India Way, Strategies for an Uncertain World, which was published in 2020.
Thank you. President IIC, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Shri N.N. Voraji, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinathji, Director IIC, K.N. Srivastavaji, ambassadors, academics, colleagues, present, past, hopefully future. It's really very good to see you, and I'm truly delighted to join you at the valedictory of this meeting. I heard with great attention the summary report of what had transpired over the last few days. And my own remarks, I'm afraid, are more prosaic, very empirical, but I assure you very encouraging. And they largely dwell around what Ambassador Shyam Saran said, which is do not underestimate the political, and I would add the economic and other aspects of our growing relationship with Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, when many of us who haven't lived there or worked there ask others about the region, I think the first thing you're told is, it's very far away. Now, when I actually did travel there, it did cross my mind that there were more faraway places like California or, I don't know, British Columbia, which has never stopped anybody from reaching there. So apparently distance is very much in people's mind. And actually once you decide to commit yourself there, I did find for my own satisfaction there were actually fairly short and neat ways of getting there, and therefore I somewhere have put that behind me, and I'm busy trying to persuade others in that direction. And when I stand before you here today, I just as a representative sample of my week, and this is only today, what, a Wednesday, okay. I've already had one vice president from the region, Bharat Jagdev. I've just had lunch with two ambassadors from New York from the region. Last month there were two presidents from the region, that is President Santokhi and President Irfan Ali. There was a foreign minister colleague of mine, Foreign Minister Tewani of Latin America, of Panama. So the point I wish to make is a lot of the preconceptions are in our own mind, but it's not a point which is relevant to any of you because you already know that. It is a point for those of us who are charged with, I would say, policy formulation and execution in regard to Latin America and the Caribbean. So how does one deal with it? One deals with it really by creating compulsions, by demonstrating contact, by frankly working the relationship. And working the relationship obviously can have many aspects, some of which are very evident in the room today, in what we have all been discussing over the last few days. But I put it to you that if there has to be a firm foundation for a sustained and intensive interaction, it has to be built on business, and it has to be built on stronger people-to-people contacts. Obviously, government has a role. Government has to lead, government has to encourage, government has to shape where necessary resource. But finally, any relationship, and we've discovered we've discovered this even with North America. that if you look today at our relationship with North America, a lot of that is really built on business and it is built on people. So I am focusing much of my remarks on those aspects because I believe that it is by taking those forward that we will create the framework on which many more activities can take place, and those activities to my mind are very important because if you have to relate to other societies, if you have to talk to them, you have to in a sense have a feel, you have to know the music, the literature, the people, their history, the food. I mean, it comes and it's a universal principle for every country. Now, when I became foreign minister 4 years ago, a colleague of mine sitting in the front row very helpfully sent me a piece urging me to pay more attention to this part of the world. And the key bit was a piece by a Chilean ambassador. I suspect, sir, it could be you, which basically said, you know, until the foreign minister of India himself pays attention to Latin America, how is that relationship going to develop? Now, you know, the first reading, I wasn't, I didn't think the foreign minister of India had to do everything. You have colleagues who also I work with. But honestly, even before that, actually, we had started a process of really globalizing our contacts, of really reaching out very much more than we used to, and there is a purpose for that, which I will come to. So, when I actually, in preparation for meeting you, said, okay, can I get a sort of a 4-year report card and a 9-year report card, because I used Prime Minister Modi's government in 2014 as a kind of a marker. I actually found that in these years we've had from India 6 visits by the President to the region, 6 visits by the Vice President, 4 visits by the Prime Minister, 4 by the External Affairs Minister. In this case happens to be me, but in my defense I'm going next month again to 4 more countries. 13 of different cabinet ministers, and our ministers of state, I think, have pretty much covered every country in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what it has done is it has in turn encouraged the reverse flow. So during this period we've also had 37 major visits from the region, 7 by the President, 5 by Vice Presidents, 15 by foreign ministers, 10 by other ministers. So the reason I say this to you is that the assumption we had that somewhere, there isn't enough attention, there isn't enough contact, there isn't enough traffic. I think the evidence of the last decade has started to challenge that. I'm not suggesting to you this is where it will stay. I think there's a lot of room. There's a very strong case for why that should grow. But this really was the first point I wanted to instill. Ambassador Shyam Saran also spoke about politics. During this period, we opened 2 embassies in the region, and both had a very interesting backstory to them. One was in Paraguay, and the other was in Dominican Republic. Now, in the case of Paraguay, it was something I was personally, in a sense, encouraged to do. I met my Paraguayan counterpart in 2019 on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and he, after the preliminary courtesy, said, I've never met an Indian foreign minister, so I want to ask you one question. What have we in Paraguay done to offend you? So obviously it sort of took me. He said, look, ever since we can remember, in every conceivable forum, we have been supportive of you. we're still trying to figure out, why don't you have an embassy in Paraguay? And the first thing I did when I came back was to tell the Prime Minister, I really need to open that embassy. And I not only opened that embassy, it got delayed because of COVID, but I promised him, which I kept my word, I went to Paraguay and actually inaugurated that embassy. Now, the other embassy I opened was a different story, a story which some of you may be more familiar with. We had a wonderful ambassador here from the Dominican Republic. And there are no superlatives to describe him. He's now in Moscow. And I was foreign secretary then, and he would keep badgering me, saying, look, I'm the dean, and you don't have an embassy in the country from where there's the dean. And during his period, if you look at the trade between India and Dominican Republic, I mean, those of you who may not be immediately familiar with trade numbers, I mean, we are talking triple-digit millions here. So I am citing these two examples really as a foretaste of what is to come. I think this is a region which has a very powerful case for much greater interaction, much greater presence, and that is the case really I want to make before you. So the first case I would make is really a case for trade. And here again, it's interesting when you drill down and look at the numbers. Our trade today with Latin America and Caribbean annually is $50 billion plus. And just to put that in perspective, our four big trade accounts, which is the US, China, European Union and ASEAN, are somewhere between 100 to 110, 115 billion dollars. So already Latin America and Caribbean has come up to half the level of the highest set of trade partners that India has. But it isn't just a numbers game that I'm putting before you. When I speak, and by the way, I must also tell you, barring a few foreign ministers, I think I have the WhatsApp number of almost everybody in Latin America and Caribbean. And even during COVID, probably there was not a single minister to whom I did not have at least one conversation. So I'm saying that to you not to demonstrate my WhatsApp skills, but actually to tell you today, the need for those contacts, to the fact that if ministers take out time and speak to each other, there is something shifting out there which should be relevant. So let me come back to trade. Trade today is growing, and if I were to just give you two examples of countries where I was recently, where Brazil is concerned, we are either the fourth or the fifth, depending on how you count the trade, and the likelihood is way. So here is a country which many people feel is far away, other end of the world, and we are among the top 5 trade partners. In the case of Argentina, we are the third or the fourth, and here again, that position with the possibility of further growth up is something which is noteworthy. But I mention trade because if we look at the complementarity today, the demand from India for natural resources, for agro products, the demand in Latin America, Caribbean for what are essentially middle class consumables, for two-wheelers, for automobiles, for pharmaceuticals. I mean, our pharma exports are really booming in that part of the world, and I can see many more as manufacturing in India picks up and becomes more competitive. So there is clearly, and the deeper middle classization of Latin America provides a market which a stronger Indian manufacturing clearly sees of great value. And again, when it comes to trade in services, here I actually had some insight from the brief period that I spent with the Tata Group, that the IT companies, trade and services among them, employ more than 100,000 people today in Latin America, and again it's growing. The second case I would make, which is related, is the case for investment. Because a lot of our investments there, a lot of our interests there, are in areas which will require us to be there, to put resources out there. And there are some truly impressive cases there.